To begin with, we want to ask a few questions just around how we study in general. And maybe we should start really at the basics here and say, you know, what do we think about before we study? How do we approach Bible study before we actually even get started? So, Brother Daryl, any ideas on just how we might think about this before we get started?
Well, first of all, good morning, everyone. So when I look at Bible study and think about approaches, I think that before we even get started, we obviously need to pick what it is that we're going to study. And what it is that we're going to study needs to be, I think, manageable. And we need to establish goals and objectives of what we want to accomplish in the study. You know, you could get into a study and it could be a huge topic. Just recently, I was going to start into a study on music. Well, that's a massive study and undertaking in all different aspects. You could look at, for instance, you could look at songs in scripture. You could look at instruction about music, musical instruments. You could look at modern music and all these different things. Like, this could be a massive study. So whenever you're starting to do a study, we need to make sure that it's manageable, break it down, give yourself little goals and objectives along the way, so that it's not overwhelming. That's one thing that I would say. And the other thing is, make the best use of your time. I've found that with, Bible study, it's always ideal if you have a set time that you can do it. And if you have a long period of time, if you have an hour and a half that you can sit down and be really devoted to it. But as life goes on and you get busier and there's more obligations with family and ecclesial things, that time can become quite limited. So I've actually found for myself that trying to make use of the little opportunities that we have, little shorter periods of time. So for me, when I travel into work, not that I've been doing that recently, but when normally I would travel into work, I would sit on the train. And I can actually pull out my phone, and a lot of the resources that we'll get into can be accessed through the phone now. And I can sit there and actually start doing some of the Bible study just in that little setting. And it might only be 15 minutes, 30 minutes, but taking little opportunities like that to just progress. Maybe it's just a word study that you want to do during that time, or maybe it's just reading the passage a few times during that time. Making the best use of those little opportunities will help a long way, because if you're just sort of waiting until you've got a big chunk of time, an hour and a half, it may never come. And obviously it's the most ideal to have that chunk. But if you're always saying, well, I'm waiting till I have several hour slots that I can do this study, you may procrastinate actually getting into the study because you may not find that you have that time. So I've tried to make use of little opportunities of times.
Okay, that's really helpful, Brother Darrell. I just like to emphasize that. I think that if you can get set up at home as well, like in a spot, if it's going to take 15 minutes every time to set up and you're only getting 15-minute sections, then, you're never going to do it. And sometimes we can spend all our time getting really well set up for games or entertainment and guess where we're going to go. It's easy to go there because we're all set up so nicely for that. But if we take that same concept for Bible study and we get ourselves nicely set up, it's easy to go in and get at it and do a few minutes here and there. So, I like that a lot, and I think it's a really good starting point for us. Is there anything else you want to add there before we get moving on here?
Well, yeah, I'll just add one more thing, and that is, and I don't know if it fits best in this question or not, but I was going to say that what I found for myself was when I was in my late teens, early 20s, I found that I had a lot more time on my hands than I do now that you've got a family and more, as I say, ecclesial obligations and things like that. And I found that when I was in my early 20s, that was the best time to do a lot of reading of Christadelphian books, becoming familiar with the history of our community, becoming familiar with the foundation works like Elpis Israel and things like that. And I found that really set me up well for later on in life and giving a good solid foundation. And so I just thought that was something I wanted to share, because when you're in your early 20s, I think I found that you can actually remember and take in a lot more than you can when you're a little bit older. Memory starts to fade a little bit, and although I'm in my 30s now, but I've even begun to see it. So taking that opportunity when you're young to just read a lot of these books and build up that kind of knowledge and foundation is a good starting place as well.
Okay. So, Brother Daryl, what do you use? We want to know, before we get into the sower and the seed again specifically, just what are your kind of go-to tools? We don't need to know them all, but ones that sort of are your highlights.
Yeah, I would say that I use half and half, hard copy books and electronic tools, because as I say, a lot of these tools now, the study tools, can be accessed online and can be downloaded in apps and things like that. So I found that's really helpful, especially when you're on the go and you're moving around. You can easily access these things now, and sometimes it's a little bit easier than picking up an actual Strong's Concordance book and looking it up. Though I do want to just point out, one brother once said that the advantage of having a hard copy book tool to actually go through is that as you're looking up the different words, you actually have time to think about and process what it is that you're reading and you're studying. And when you're quickly looking up these things, sometimes you don't have that time to really think about what it is you're studying. So you do want to make sure that you take that time to think through what it is that you're actually looking up. But the tools that I usually go to, I use Strong's and Englishman's Concordance. So looking up not only the meaning of the word, but more importantly, where else is that word used in Scripture? Because I want to know, how does the Scripture use that word elsewhere? And trying to find similar contexts. So if you can find a place in Scripture that uses actually a number of the words that you find in one passage, then that other passage might be a good link that you could go to that might shed some more light on understanding that passage. Actually, we have an example of that coming up in the class. I also use the Treasury of Scripture Knowledge, which basically gives you a whole bunch of cross-references. That's basically what that tool does. And then also the cross-references within the margin of the scriptures. Again, this is trying to find other similar passages to let the Scripture interpret Scripture. I go to sometimes other translations. My go-to translation is the New American Standard, but I also use some other ones as well. The ESV and sometimes the Net Bible. Occasionally I'll go to the Amplified Bible or one of the other ones, Young's Literal Translation. I also use Vines. That's specifically for New Testament words, and that helps to be able to look up a word and see all the different words that are used for that, and it helps to give a definition based upon how the Scripture uses that word. Then there's just Bible dictionaries and encyclopedias. I have another book called Nelson's Bible Maps and Charts, which contains all kinds of charts and maps for every book of the Bible. So that's quite a useful tool to have. And then, of course, your library of Christadelphian books. I tried to build that up over the years and have a number of bookshelves. And so always trying to have some good references to go to in whatever we're studying, to get others' opinions on these things and insight. And then also Christadelphian talks, which there's tons of them online. So those are my main tools that I go to.
Okay, well, that's very helpful. We just pick up on one of them. Vines is kind of an old classic, and And again, for people who want to do word studies, if you don't have a better way of doing it, as Brother Daryl says, it's a way of grouping the relevant words together immediately. So you can look up the English word, and I've got a Vines right here. And when you look it up, listed are the verbs, the adverb forms, the nouns, the adjectives, but they're all clustered together so that you can do immediately a nice study on that word without trying to find all the Strong's numbers that relate to it. And sometimes finding all those Strong's numbers is quite a challenge. I spent a lot of time trying to do that in different studies until I found what was called the Strong's Tree Searcher. We might be able to demo that at some point. We'll see. But just note that the Strong's Tree Searcher, it's an online tool, and it's extremely helpful in finding all the related words, the family of words that you want to study when you're looking at something. Okay, well, let's move on then to verse by verse in, sort of specifically here, and as it relates to your study. There's all these different ways of studying the Bible. You can go in at themes and characters and such like, but verse by verse has got to be the most fundamental, basic way of doing things. We really need to be able to do a verse by verse study. Sometimes we got to go to a section. Brothers, sisters, young people, whoever we are, we want to know what that means, and we got to sort of get into it. How do you approach that from a verse by verse perspective in relation to maybe other types of study?
Yeah, and as you say, verse by verse really actually ties into a lot of the other ones too. You're going to do a character study. You're evidently going to find yourself in a verse by verse study, or even thematic things. You're going to find yourself in different places. But when I start a verse by verse study, if I'm studying a chapter or a book or whatever it is, I find that the most fundamental thing is you don't want to, as the saying goes, miss the forest for the trees. So you want to make sure that you can see the big picture first and foremost. You want to establish that as well. Like what is the big picture or the story, or what is the what's the flow of thought or the argument? If you're reading one of Paul's letters, you want to make sure you understand the whole argument of the section first before you start getting into the nitty-gritty of each of the verses, because you always want to keep everything in its proper context. So that's the first thing that I always do is look for the big picture. And then my next approach is really to read the passage over and over again. You want to read it to be able to, first of all, establish that context. But then I read it to look for things like, what are some of the main themes that come out in those verses? Are there any repeated words or phrases? That's really important. If you can see that there's some kind of words that pop up several times in a passage, then that should trigger you to sort of say, well, there's something important here about this particular word, or it might be that you can uncover something through the use of repeated words or a sequence of words. And then I try to just read each verse on its own really slowly. And as you do so, just start asking questions and start walking through it to say, why are these words used? What is it that we're being told in this verse? You can easily take a section of verses and just come across something in the verse and just completely even miss it. Or you might just sort of say, well, I don't really know what that means, and just sort of gloss over it and just continue on. With a verse by verse study, you want to be able to answer those questions, such as what's the significance of every phrase and every word? What does it mean? So getting into that, asking those questions, and then from that, now you've got a good base to be able to say, okay, what is it that I'm going to now look into? And then we start getting into our word studies, so looking at the key words, looking at the cross references, trying to find the other passages that can help shed light on the understanding of some of these passages. And then from there, I also bring in then other resources. So I'll bring in other Christadelphian books to help expand, the thinking on that passage, and start to. And if you've come up with some kind of strange idea, you might want to actually bounce it off of those other books too, and try and find out what other brethren have said about those things. Or it might be vice versa. You might find that in one of the books that your resources that you're using, it might have some kind of odd idea about the passage. And I'm not saying dismiss it right away, but we want to make sure that we carefully search through it and carefully examine that idea, and before we just readily accept it, especially if it's a new kind of idea that's out there, just to make sure that we've done due diligence before we sort of run with it and present it. So
what I heard initially was, when you do verse by verse studies, don't do verse by verse studies to begin with. Get the big picture. And I think that's a good piece of advice there, as opposed to starting with the first word and detailing it and the first phrase and the first verse. Is get a little bit of a big picture first. So that's really helpful. And then move yourself into that verse by verse approach, where now you're dissecting and getting the most out of it. It could be a frustrating experience, because it probably in some ways is a very detailed way of going about it. And I can certainly think of my own experience of starting out doing verse by verse and never getting to where I actually wanted to end up. I remember starting Isaiah. I was going to take on the book of Isaiah verse by verse, and I got to chapter 9, and that's where it ended. Even earlier than that, I think when I was a younger person, I was doing James. And James, you'd think you could get to the end of, but the way I started it, I mean, and I was writing things in my margin, they were all so tiny and small and minute and detailed, and I don't think I got past the first chapter that first time through James. So, yeah, it's very rewarding, but you can get frustrated if you are so deep and you take on too much, which is interesting. You're doing the Sower, the parable of the Sower, which is, kind of hopping right into the middle of a gospel. You didn't have to do all of Luke to do it. How did you kind of approach that? Because you do have multiple accounts. How did you approach that study?
So actually, this was one of my earlier studies that I actually did on the parables in preparation for the 2008 youth conference. I was writing the workbook for that. And when we sat down, I mean, initially I thought, we're going to do all the parables in the Gospel of Luke. And again, overwhelming. You can't do all the parables. I mean, so the nice thing about parables is they are a small chunk. So you can take one parable at a time. And if you don't get to all of them, you don't get to all of them. So I think that helps that you take little chunks to begin with. But then, as you say, there is, you've got these parables in multiple accounts. And one of the things that we're going to highlight in the talk is, what's the differences between the Gospels? And in particular, we're going to look at what's the difference, what's Luke's perspective as compared to Matthew and Mark's perspective. So when you come to that and you've got something in multiple Gospels, comparing the different Gospels and noting what's the differences, where does the focus go in each of those Gospels, that's a very interesting and rewarding study in itself, to actually sort of highlight those little phrases and examine why those differences are there, and what do they tell us? What are we being told? So that was kind of the approach that I took with the parables. So I used one gospel as sort of the focus. It was Luke, but then I also compared it with Matthew and Mark as well. And if you're going to do the whole, say you're going to do a study on the whole parable of the sower, you'd want to bring in all three gospels and do a verse by verse on each of them and sort of do it in parallel as you go through.
Why did you choose Luke as the base?
I think at the time, I was interested in Luke in the fact of his perspective. Obviously, it's a fine balance between how much the writer himself interjects into the writing of the gospel, along in conjunction with being guided by the Spirit. So taking those things in proper balance. Luke comes from things as a perspective of a physician. And we also know that Luke's gospel is associated with the priestly work of Christ. Christ is the man. And I think at the time I was looking at Luke's gospel and actually fascinated with the fact of what is in there and how does he put things across, and how does he put things across in the parables that ties into that idea of the priest that is having compassion on people, that is reaching out to all different people. That's a theme in Luke. And so I was looking for that as well as going through the parables. I think that was one of the reasons we chose Luke as the base. But I mean, we could have chosen Matthew or Mark, but Luke was just the focus at the time.
Right. So if we have any questions for Brother Daryl, now would be the time to start sending them in. I think we've answered this one question that's come in, Daryl. It says, how do you practically compile all the details of a parable when it occurs in multiple Gospels? I think you've answered that, for example, the parable of the sower. But if there's any other questions that people want to pass in now would be a good time to send those into us. Just while we're doing that, I'll just show you the Strong's tree searcher here. And it comes at a kind of a strange web address. Somehow it's related to the UK. So if something's from the UK is coming here that's helping us out, the-boltons.co.uk/ss/ and it's called Strong's Tree Searcher. And so the nice thing about this is you can put in a word like we'll do here right now. We'll pick one from last night because I don't want to do any of the work from Daryl's study here. But let's put in 4704. That happens to be our word study in 2 Timothy 2:15. And so you can see it's this word spoudazo, but underneath it, you can see that it's from 47110. So you get the root word for it. You press that up, and now you've got the word spood. But underneath, you'll see that there's a bunch of related words, and there are other forms. And so as you, without going to the nth degree on this, just to show you how it works, by going down those different paths, you can actually get a list of all the relevant words. In this case, like I said last night, there's actually 8 words. And so you can get that group. So if you got a Vines, like Brother Daryl said, that can be really helpful in getting that family. If you've got a Strong's Tree Searcher available to you, just a click, bam, you can work out through that all the related words. Other studies that help, other study books are like the Theological Word Study of the Old Testament. That's extremely helpful for word studies and bringing together different forms of words, and also what's called the TDNT in the New Testament, again, for the exhaustive word studies for us. So those are great sources of really getting behind the words when you want to be into the details of a word and really working those out. So do we have any other questions yet? We got another one that came here. Do you Bible mark into your margin as you study, or do you compile down your notes and then come back to Bible mark later? Brother Daryl.
I would say it's probably a combination of both, and it depends on, for instance, if it's words. If I note it, like one of the things I love to highlight is if there's repeated words or phrases. I love to highlight those so I can see, oh, there's a theme here, and then so I'll do some highlighting as I go through. If it's a word study, I might note down in the margin what it is that I've found in the use of that word. But I would say that anything else is probably going to come in later, and I'd like to take notes on paper, and then from there, once the study is done, or the section of verses, then I'll go back and start noting those things in, because you never know, if you might get further down the road in your study and then have to look back to something earlier on and realize that maybe what you found out earlier wasn't necessarily, you might have rethought it a little bit. But I think, I mean, the word study per se, I mean, isn't necessarily going to vastly change, I mean, the meaning of the word, depending on where you go. So those things I'll note down as I go, but then mark things in at the end.
Okay, well, that's very helpful. I've got a few Bibles here, and I got one that I'm going to perfectly Bible mark someday, and it's perfectly blank, and it hasn't started. I'm not sure I'll ever get to it. I think the Bible is best to have a kind of a feel of a workbook a little bit, and we might want a system and such like, but the main thing is to start marking in when you get good ideas from talks and from studies to start using it, because initially when I started, I wanted to have, if it goes into the Bible margin, like it's got to be inspired practically, so that they're inspired margins, which they never quite are. But I found thereafter, watching other people, is that they're just getting things in the margin because they're helpful. Somehow it's nice to be able to have a little bit of way of indicating the source. And I know some people put in that it was, the initials of the speaker, if it's from a Bible talk, or the lexicon that it's coming from. I like to know the sources, so that, again, I even sometimes put question marks when a speaker puts something in there, and I thought, well, that's interesting, but I want to verify it myself. I put a little question mark in along with it.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. I mean, I find that if I don't put things in my margin and I just take them on a piece of notes on a piece of paper, you can easily misplace that piece of paper, or you lose it, or it just goes in a notebook somewhere, and I never reference it. Now, I've done a new thing recently, and this is very recent, but I've started to, you get handouts and all kinds of things from people. And for me, if you're anything like me, they ended up in a pile somewhere or in a folder, and you don't quite know what's there. So what I've started to do is actually scan in all these notes and handouts into the computer, and I've arranged them into folders, and so I've set up folders that are like a Genesis folder, an Exodus folder. It might be character studies or thematic studies, or just folders to be able to organize these things. And then I throw those notes in there, labeling them properly, so that then you can actually go and find these things quite easily. So that's something I've done recently, just to help have easier access to the various resources that you'll pick up over many years. Because if you don't know what's there, then it's great that you got a handout, but it's not going to be much use to you if you forget that you got it.
Right. Okay, well, that's great. That's a good start for the morning, and God willing, we will have your class at 10 o'clock. We'll look forward to actually seeing what comes out of Bible study and is formulated into a class on a verse-by-verse basis on the sower of the seed.